This Is Where the Serpent Lives is the first novel by short story writer Daniyal Mueenuddin. So how did long form work out for our friend Mr. M? Hi, I'm Amanda, and this is Spineless Books, spoiler-free reviews for readers and listeners like me. If this is your first time visiting the channel, please consider subscribing, as I know most of you who are watching have not subscribed. So I would really appreciate your support. What you'll get in exchange is a new review every week, always spoiler-free. I have to confess, I found out about This Is Where the Serpent Lives in a very unusual way. I had never heard of this book, and I had never heard of this author. And randomly, I decided to ask Gemini what books it thought would be trending right now. I was curious what books would make good videos. And this was the only book that I either hadn't read or hadn't heard of. So when I got it from the library, I dove in head first and completely blind to what the story was about. Author Daniyal Mueenuddin has appeared in many places. His writing, short stories are all over the place. He's won lots of awards, been nominated for many more, and he has a really interesting upbringing. He was born in Los Angeles, but he was raised in Lahore, Pakistan, which is where this book is set. And then he went to school in the United States, he attended Yale, he eventually became a lawyer, he worked in New York, and now he splits his time between Lahore, Pakistan, where he has a farm, and Oslo, Norway. So he's a man about town, you might say. The book is set in Lahore, Pakistan on a farm, and the farm is pivotal as it's what connects all of the characters. Now, I'm not talking about it connects them in like a Northwoods by Daniel Mason, the place is a character sort of way. It's just the thing that all of these characters have in common. And you don't always know that right away, but eventually that comes to fruition for pretty much everybody in the story. I have to say though, I found the beginning of this book confusing because I didn't understand that all of the characters connected to the farm. In fact, some of them felt like they were completely separate storylines in the beginning, and I was getting these little snippets of things that didn't have a clear thread. So that made the first half of this book a lot of work to follow, like I wanted a character chart kind of work. There were also characters who emerged partway through the story, and then it turned out they were just there to support a character I already knew, and then they sort of went off and did their own thing and I never heard from them again. I didn't love that part of this book. There were a lot of people to keep track of and I wasn't sure why everyone was there, and weirdly, this book immediately reminded me of The Covenant of Water. You were just getting person after person introduced. Unlike The Covenant of Water, however, this story is not particularly linear. At least it didn't seem to me to be linear as a listener. With The Covenant of Water, Abraham Verghese introduced me to each character, and then when there was a change in who the sort of primary character was, which happened a couple of times, he handed me off to that character. So it wasn't as though I was just sort of grabbing at the air and hoping I figured out who it was meant to be. It was very clear in what I would consider a linear narrative from Verghese. Mueenuddin is not using a linear narrative. In fact, he's telling stories of certain characters and then shifting to other characters and hoping I've still held on to that first story when I get back because that character is going to suddenly join the character I've just been listening about. It's a little bit much, honestly. That being said, once the connections became clear, I was deeply invested. I would say it was about the midway point of this book. So you had sort of the before where I was a little bit confused and the after where everything sort of gelled and suddenly became perfectly clear. I really cared about the characters and I love the way Mueenuddin presented class in Pakistan. You've got on this farm the extremely wealthy, and then you've got people who might as well be born into slavery because they're never going to rise beyond their station. And you get to understand what is normal interaction between their classes and what's not, and what kind of just happens on the farm and is okay, but might not be okay or might have to be different outside of the farm. It was a really interesting study, and it covers Pakistan from the 1950s through present day, so you get a strong sense of how things shift and change. While this strategy of describing characters in fits and starts got really confusing in the beginning of the book, it did clear up, and ultimately I think it served the story well, even though I didn't like what I was listening to until it became clear. Speaking of listening, Mueenuddin narrated his own story, as did Abraham Verghese in The Covenant of Water. It's just really hard not to see the connection between these two stories. I would bet money that Mueenuddin was influenced by the Covenant of Water, because it just has a very similar feel. That epic, long storytelling, although it is about half the length of Covenant of Water. Mueenuddin was not a phenomenal narrator, but he wasn't a bad narrator either. He doesn't do any character voices or extreme dramatization. He just kind of reads his story. But he reads it well, and he reads it with great inflection, and I found him easy to follow. He wasn't particularly slow or fast, although I will confess, I sped this book up. When I was in the first half of the story, and I wasn't really following how all of the characters connected, and to be fair, I'm not the only one who has reported this problem, so it's not like it was just me spacing out. But in the beginning, I thought, I don't really understand what's going on, so I like it, but I'm going to listen to it a little bit faster. By the time I got to the middle of the story, I probably would not have needed it sped up, but I was already there, so in the name of efficiency, why not keep going a little bit faster? I have a sneaky suspicion that this book, based on its content, sort of this history of class in Pakistan from the 50s to today, I think this book is going to be up for some awards. I think it might be one of those ones that not everybody has heard of when it suddenly wins something big, and I'm just going to throw that prediction out there, because if I happen to be right about this, I'll be really proud of myself. Not that it's a contest, just something that my gut says that this book is going to be one that ends up on more people's radar than it is right now. There are several characters who become really influential in the book. Yazid, who the book begins with, Saqib, who shows up a little bit later in the story, and Hisham, who is the farm owner. Now, I feel like Yazid and Saqib are the two characters I'm really meant to empathize with, and they are the lower class characters in the story. But with that said, Hisham was not unlikable. I did kind of like him, even though he was the ultra-rich. I don't think he was a bad guy. I think he definitely had some flaws, but it was interesting to feel empathy and kind of be okay with everybody, even though there was a very vast difference in position between the three characters. I think it's also important to say that, as you can probably predict, given that this deals with the class differences in Pakistan, there are some moments in the book that are difficult. There are some places where people are mistreated or handled differently because of their class, and I just want to throw that out there. There are some difficult moments, but I felt personally like by the time we got to those parts of the book, I was invested in the characters and I did care about them enough to want to go through those moments with them and to know how they came out on the other side. So I think that's really important to hear. Not quite a trigger warning, but like there's some rough stuff in Pakistan and it's not all nice. Just like in any culture you'd find that. This book goes there. I think as far as Mueenuddin's writing is concerned, I'd give this book 5 stars hands down. He's incredibly descriptive, the dialogue was wonderful, he builds really tense scenes with ease, but I have to cut this back to 4. In retrospect, in reflecting on what I read, I do think it felt more like vignettes, and that makes sense given that he's a short story writer. But in truth, this is one long story. So the fact that it felt like vignettes and I struggled to connect those vignettes, even though I was carefully listening, I gotta bring it down to 4. I do think it's a worthwhile read, and I do think this is a book that people are gonna discuss with ease. There's lots to dig into, lots of characters to talk about, lots of decisions and moments to go over. But I just couldn't get behind the fact that the first half of the book was a struggle, even though the second half was so wonderful. So I'll give Mr. Mueenuddin a little bit of grace, given that it's his first long-form novel, but at the same time, it just couldn't hold up to 5 stars for me, although I think if I was judging only the second half, it would have been an easy 5-star read. But it taps out at 4 because the first half was honestly a little bit of a struggle to follow. I always appreciate learning about a new culture, and this book definitely accomplished that for me. I'm not going to assume that this is a representation of everything that's ever happened in Pakistan, but I do feel like I got more of an inside look into the class structure there, one that I didn't have before. So let me know in the comments if you intend to read this book, or if it's new to you, as Ann Patchett says. But I'd love to discuss it with those of you who have read it. I've seen it on the shelves in Barnes & Noble, so I know I can't be the only one out there who's read it, but I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. But remember, you might love what I hate and hate what I love. So make your own opinion, but thanks for listening to mine. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel. See you next time with another spoiler-free review.